Hello everyone, welcome back. My name is James. I'm the creator of the Raven of the Scythe fantasy role-playing game, which you can download for free at drivethrurpg.com, links in the description, or you can check out the world of Arovingia that I created for Raven of the Scythe at World Anvil, link for that's in the description also. So in this video, what I wanted to talk about a bit was classes in fantasy role-playing games, or any role-playing game for that matter. And honestly, like the concept of classes and the role that they play in games like this is really neat, and I came into the hobby through Dungeons and Dragons 2nd Edition, which really uses classes a lot. It's a very core element to that game, and the presence of classes in a role-playing game, usually right alongside levels, is one of the ways that you can actually describe a game. Like, if you say that a game is a class level game, then people can already infer quite a bit of information about the game system just from those two descriptors. So, since I like classes so much, why didn't I use them? Raven of the Scythe is a game that has neither classes or levels. So how did that come to be? And what was going on in my head whenever I made the decision to go classless with Raven of the Scythe? And that is a pretty fundamental question to the game, how it plays and its identity within the hobby. And so this is going to be more of a game design video than a world building type video. But game design is an important part of role playing, so let's get right into it. With Raven of the Scythe, when I started out, I was actually trying to make a very traditional class level style game. The game that I saw in my head, which was at the time called Song of Ages, I think was what its working title was, it had classes and levels. So it was over time that the levels and the classes got weeded out. I can't remember which one went first, and that probably was simultaneously. And the issue with classes is, and the reason that ultimately I removed them from the game, is that with classes you run into a neat little way of defining a character with a 1 to 2 word descriptor. So for instance, if you say fighter, that means something. If you say magic user, that means something. If you say ranger, that means something. Like, all of these words are loaded language. Like, as soon as you say the name of any class that has traditionally existed in fantasy role-playing game to any degree, everything from the fighters and bards of Dungeons and Dragons to the red mages of Final Fantasy, like, you already know a good bit of information about this character just through the name of the class. And while that is really, really cool and effective when communicating information about a character, it can also be kind of limiting. And as Song of Ages transitioned into Raven of the Scythe, and the scope of the game started becoming more broad, the idea of single-use classes really didn't fit that well. So for instance, if I say I want to make a fighter in Raven of the Scythe, well, does that cover everything from a standard melee-focused soldier type? Does that also cover an archer or a duelist type character? What about a brutish type character, like a tank that can take a lot of hit points? versus a charismatic knight in shining armor type. All of those things could technically fall into the preview of the word fighter, but each one of those means something else. So for the sake of Raven of the Scythe, I needed to decide what the word fighter meant. And since I could never come up with a satisfactory definition for those words, I eventually just decided to scrap classes altogether. So whenever, and I'm going to stick with fighter here because I think that's the most basic. It doesn't require any, like, you know what a fighter does because it's literally in the name, fighter. They fight things. Whenever I was making Raven of the Scythe, I was thinking, okay, so should a class define everything that a character is good at? So for instance, if you say fighter, does that mean your character is good at fighting and nothing else? Or does that mean that your character has a general suite of skills and abilities with some special abilities related to fighting? And I was kind of a fan of the second one, but because that allowed more variety in the types of characters you could make. So for instance, you could run a fighter who was also a social character, or a fighter who was also kind of sneaky, but your sneaky fighter is never going to be as sneaky as a rogue type character, or your charismatic fighter is never going to be as charismatic as the diplomat class, or whatever I was going to call it back then. I can't remember. And well, I think that's fine game design. It really didn't work with what I was doing with Raven of the Scythe. So since we're on the topic of classes, I do want to talk a little bit about classes in a couple of other games. Specifically, Fantasy Age, which is made by Green Ronin, I think off the top of my head. They also did the Dragon Age game, which uses the same system. Big fan of that game. Really like that game. Really like the rule set and the system that they used. But I have some issues with the classes, especially in Dragon Age. They kind of cleaned it up a bit in Fantasy Age, and I liked it a whole lot more in Fantasy Age. But in Dragon Age, it had some issues. One of them being, once again, with the fighter. In Dragon Age, one of the primary abilities that the fighter class gets is that they increase the number of weapon proficiencies that they have, which makes sense because a fighter is familiar with a wide variety of weapons. They can pick up a weapon and use that weapon effectively. And that's one of the main advantages that they get as they level. And I think that is a really weak ability because in my experience, most characters figure out what weapon they want their character to use and they stick with it. The idea of having a versatile suite of weapons that you use depending on the situation or whatever, it's a cool idea and you could definitely do something with it. But that seems to be the exception rather than the rule, and it feels like that, especially when they were making Dragon Age, they didn't know what they were doing with the fighter class. One of the other abilities that fighters get in that game is that they can start taking fighting styles based on the types of weapons that they tend to use. So for instance, they could learn, it's been a while since I played this, but off the top of my head, I know like two-handed weapons or sword and shield style fighting or things like that. And those are all really cool. I like that. I like the way that in that sense, they made the fighters uniquely good at fighting compared to the other classes. But one of the issues that I also had with that, and this kind of runs into what I was talking about with the definition of classes. So, and I hope I'm not completely wrong here, but I remember playing in a Dragon Age game where there's a class for like a mounted fighter type class. I think it's a specialization called a Chevalier, I think is how they say it in that setting. And gives you 3 abilities like all the other specializations do, but one of them has nothing to do with fighting on horseback. It has to do with it gives you like a charisma bonus or something like that. And I probably should have done some more research before I started this video, but I just thought of this. So, and my issue with that is if I want to take a specialization that gives me cool horse fighting abilities, or fighting from horseback, not fighting horses, then why am I getting this bonus to my social skills? And this goes into that weird conflict between your class and what exactly it represents. So if you wanted to play the charismatic knight in shining armor type, wouldn't it make more sense to take horse fighting as a specialization and then maybe take another specialization for like courtly etiquette or something? I don't know. There's a lot of different ways you can go about doing that kind of class, ability, character concept, relationships, and I didn't particularly enjoy the way they did that in Dragon Age. By the time Fantasy Age came around, they had cleaned it up quite a bit, and off the top of my head, I don't really have too many issues with the classes in that game. There are a couple, but they're minor and not really related to what we're talking about here. I think Fantasy Age is much better than Dragon Age, and I already thought Dragon Age was pretty cool, so don't take any of this as a condemnation of that game. I really like it. In then Dungeons & Dragons, which is probably the most famous fantasy role-playing game, my issue with the classes that they use there kind of goes into the same kind of issue. Is so you have classes such as fighter and cleric and barbarian and bard and rogue and wizard and sorcerer and all this other stuff that in some way defines what your character does. Like, this is how they solve their problems, this is where they get their abilities, whether or not they were raised in a monastery by kung fu monks, or whether they grew up on the streets learning how to pickpockets and stab backs. Whatever it is, your class will explain that about your character, and that's pretty cool. And then there's the barbarian class. And I take issue with the barbarian class specifically because the barbarian class not only defines what your character does, it defines who your character is more, I think, than any other class in the game. Just the word itself, barbarian, which, if I'm not completely wrong on my history, originally was a Roman word meant to describe people without a written language. And then in the world of D&D, describes like the uncivilized lands. It comes with a cultural baggage to it that the other classes don't have. So, does that mean everyone who lives in a barbarian land is a barbarian class? Or does that mean that people who, say, live in Waterdeep or wherever can't be barbarians because they're not from that region? It's a weird dichotomy that you don't get with the other classes, and this could have all been corrected, or not corrected, because I'm not in any position of authority. Dungeons & Dragons is obviously doing fine without my input, but this is an issue that irks me specifically. This is an issue that could have been avoided if they had simply called the class something different. They could have called it champion or brute or something like that, or maybe even like savage or something, and focus on the tough fighter angle more than things like animal totems and wilderness proficiency and stuff like that. Like, that's certainly a valid character type, but to me it's always stood out amongst the other classes. So, since those are some things that were on my mind when I was making a game and wanting to avoid and stuff like that, I then looked at a game that I really, really liked the way they handled classes, which was Alternity. It's an old science fiction game from TSR before they got bought by Wizards of the Coast. And I think Alternity is a fantastic game. Until the new Call of Cthulhu rules came out, Alternity has been my favorite role-playing game for years. I love that game. But It's also a class system because this is a science fiction game kind of built on the groundwork that Dungeons and Dragons had already established at this point in history. And so they used classes. But the way they used classes was that each class basically just got a bonus when advancing certain skills. So for instance, if you were a combat specialist, then combat related skills are cheaper for you than social skills are. You can still buy as many social skills as you want, but the combat skills are going to be significantly less expensive. And in addition to that, each class also gets one ability related to their chosen aptitude, I guess. I don't know. So for instance, with a combat specialist, I believe their bonus was that they get a one-step advantage with using a particular type of weapon, which was a pretty big deal in Alternity. With the free agent, they get an extra last resort point, which allows them to do more like daring do type roguish things, you know, like basically survive by the seat of their pants and stupid dumb luck, stuff like that. The technical operative, I can't remember actually off the top of my head what their special ability was. But then I thought the coolest one was the diplomat, which was their class was they get a bonus to upgrading their social skills just like any other class, but they also get to pick one other class and purchase skills from it as if they were members of that class. So if you chose to be a diplomat / combat specialist, you would basically be as good at fighting as a combat specialist based on how much your skills cost, but you wouldn't get the class bonus that combat specialist had. It's weird actually to try to explain it, but it's a really cool way that they handled that. And if you're interested in game design, I would suggest looking into it. I've never seen any other game do it quite this well, and in play, I've never seen this particular. I've never seen a system work quite like this before this well. I really like it, and I will always recommend Alternity to anyone. So, with that all being said, when Raven of the Scythe came around and I went to design the character building methods for that game, the idea of classes didn't really fit. Like, I had several ideas. I had some what I thought were really cool ideas of different classes that I wanted to include, but ended up figuring out that for me personally, for this game, the concept of classes, even if I broadened them out like Alternity did, was just too narrow for my particular wheelhouse of game design. So, without classes, how do you make characters in Raven of the Scythe? So, every character is pretty basic starting out. Like, no character has an advantage or disadvantage in any one area. You have complete control to build your character in any direction that you want. And through the favors and skills that you take, but specifically favors, I've noticed that people tend to build characters around usually two concepts. If you want to build your character around a single concept, you can do that, I guess, but you're going to basically run out of options a little bit sooner. The game really doesn't support like going all in on a complete one-trick pony. It can be done, but I just don't think you're getting as much out of it. But if you pick two concepts for your character, like let's say you want to be good at fighting and armor use, or magic and an animal companion, or roguish type things / nature. Like, it seems like 2 is kind of the magic number when it comes to different concepts you can build off of. With 3, you can do it, but you run into like kind of the jack of all trades, master of none type situation where you're just spread too thin. It's a valid build, of course, if you are wanting to go that, but in my experience, just from what I've seen and feedback I've gotten from playtesters and stuff, that's not necessarily the optimal way to build your character. So, since favors represent the most of the abilities in the game are acquired through favors. And favors typically exist in a tree type situation where you have one favor that you take to start off with, and then it will open up other favors that you can advance in and specialize in further. Most favor trees, with some exceptions, have about 3 steps in them. And the more powerful favors require a higher skill, so you're going to have to build your whatever skill you're working on before you can take the favors to get the abilities. It's kind of a thing. So typically what people will do is, at character creation, most characters start out with 2 favors, and they will pick the starting favor of both of their 2 character concepts. So if you want to be a fighter / animal companion character, then you would pick the first level in whatever fighting style you want to use, and you would take the first level of the animal companion favor tree. As your character advances, you will gain additional favors in both of those trees. There are a couple of favor trees that have more options, and the reason for that is because some things just require more investment to be good at them. Magic is the primary example of that, because with magic, there's a lot to learn and there's a lot of ground to cover, and if you want to really get into the depths of arcane lore and mystical power, you're going to need to devote a lot of effort to it. Not everyone wants to invest that much effort into it, and that's fine, and they will be a magic user / something else. The other one is actually broadsword fighting. With broadswords, the way I tried to emphasize that broadswords were a very common, versatile weapon was made their skill tree longer. And as a result, if you want to learn every single trick in the book when it comes to using a broadsword, it's going to require a bit more investment of experience than it will to learn, say, axes or pole arms or something like that. And after playing this game for about a year and with a couple of groups and seeing how different people make their characters and getting feedback from playtesters, I'm pretty happy with the way this game turned out, and its lack of classes in a traditional sense hasn't really hurt it. And I have noticed that people tend to gravitate toward character concepts that would have fallen into a class as it is. But since the game allows a lot of customization when you're building your character, you're not stuck in any particular niche, I guess. You can figure out what it is you want your character to do and build in that direction. But that's just my opinion, and of course I'm very, very close to this system. If you have any thoughts about classes, how character concepts are expressed through Raven of the Scythe, or any other role-playing system that you're interested in, please let me know in the comments below. If you haven't already, check out Raven of the Scythe. It's available for free at drivethrurpg.com. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a good day.